the outline in the chat box, but just some quick housekeeping matters. Kindly requesting all participants to ensure your mics are muted and your camera is switched off. After this recording is currently streaming live on Dawn's YouTube and Facebook social media pages. The discussions for today will run for an hour and a half. We have 5 speakers who will be sharing their views on the topic. Each speaker is given 7 minutes. Following the presentation, we will open up the Q&A for questions. If you wish to ask your question, please post your question in the Q&A box and our moderator will attend to your question. If you wish to ask a live question, please do so by raising your hand. You would be asked to, by doing an introduction, your name, your organization, and the moderator will ask you to have your question. Thank you very much, and it's over to Marioni, who would be moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joey, for that welcome. Pacific greetings to everybody. I'm Marioni Chung, and I'm an associate with Dawn, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for our event today. So deep sea mining is currently advancing in the Pacific. And if it goes ahead, it will destroy marine biodiversity and marine life in the area of the planet that we still know too little about, and interfere with the ocean systems that are vital to storing carbon and therefore regulating climate with potentially enormous consequences. The livelihoods, health, and well-being of women, indigenous people, and island and coastal communities across the world, and especially for small island developing states. Experimental seabed mining could commence in the international waters governed by the International Seabed Authority as early as next year, with risks to the planet's largest ecosystem. It could also be fatal to fisheries, the food security of coastal and island communities. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, resources in the deep seabed beyond national jurisdictions constitute the common heritage of mankind. This common heritage of mankind is narrowly interpreted to mean all member states of the ISA should benefit equitably from the exploitation of seabed minerals in our oceans. Our discussions today will contest this equality perspective and the instrumentalization of gender equality in deep sea mining agendas. The International Seabed Authority and industry players have been highlighting how they are creating opportunities for women marine scientists in deep sea mining. The ISA in their 2021 report claimed to be contributing to the SDG Goal 5 on gender equality. And industry players such as the metals company, formerly known as Deep Green, and their salesmen, the international Danish architect firm known as BIG, sell DSM as key building blocks for a green technological revolution to address the climate crisis we currently face. The ISA has issued 31 exploration contracts to corporations sponsored by ISA member states and is pushing to conclude negotiations on a mining code to enable mining to commence as early as next year. As our speakers are presenting on various issues to consider, I would invite the participants to ponder on these questions. Who really stands to gain from the exploitation of our ocean, on the exploitation of our ocean minerals? Unchecked, weakly regulated corporate power poses serious threats to women's human rights. How does DSM impact women's access to common property, healthy natural environments, public resources, and provisioning when mining privatizes, destroys, alienates, and further industrializes our oceans? And what about women's access to basic goods, social services, and healthy oceans with the supposed gender equality benefits of deep sea mining? It's against this backdrop that Dawn and Pang and many others share serious concerns for deep sea mining. Its irreversible harm to biodiversity with little to zero likelihood of recovery, the unseemly haste with which Pacific states and recently formed mining companies, who appear to be venture capitalists fundraising for expected huge returns on experimental mining, are pushing ahead for deep sea mining in the Pacific Ocean, with the evident support of the ISA. Without further delay, I will now introduce our first speaker for today, Mariama Williams. Mariama is a feminist economist with over 20 years working experience on economic development, macroeconomics, trade, external debt, and finance issues, with a focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, social equity, sustainable finance, and development and climate change issues. She's the director of the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica and a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network, the Gender and Trade Coalition, and a principal consultant with Integrated Policy Research Institute. Mariama is the author of a number of publications and is currently a senior associate with the Political Ecology and Sustainability Program of Dawn. Greetings, Mariama. Thank you for joining us.
Yes. Greetings, everyone. Greetings. Good morning, good evening, good night to everyone. This is a global panel, and I know people are up late, some are up early. For me, it's just about twilight hours, so I'm in good stead. Though it's about an hour from my bedtime, my normal bedtime. I'm an early morning riser. So thank you so much. This is an amazing panel. First, I must put a disclaimer that I'm not in any way an expert on the topic. I come to this, I bring my perspective from 20 years of following trade negotiations, 10 to 15 years of climate negotiations, and a whole host of things, which unfortunately left me very cynical and very sad as I sat here today reading about the deep sea mining, because I can see the parallels for climate change, which we have been negotiating since 1992. And despite supposedly a global support for it, we haven't been able to solve that issue, and it's getting worse and worse every day. So I don't come with a very optimistic heart about the deep sea mining when I realize the extent of the money that has been put into the technology of it. And I just read a recent paper that came out financed by the Mental Company, a Yale University study that's like halfway here, halfway there. It may do this, but it will be great, but it may do this, it kind of hedging. And then at the end of the study, I saw it was financed by the mineral company. I said, okay, now I understand. So the oil is being greased for really getting a decision out of the ISA that will allow this, unless somehow we can really marshal the world really fully to understand the serious danger, catastrophic danger of this approach. And it really saddens me to think that many of our developing countries who have been fighting in climate change and talking about development versus survival and accusing other countries of choosing development versus their survival are the ones leading the charge for deep sea mining, which has such catastrophic impact, not just for the region, but for climate change. Right? As I read and I studied and I looked at it. So I have 3 or 4 things to say. one is that the ocean, our ocean, it's not this narrative of this vast remote ocean out there with non-human life that we don't need to be concerned about, but has all these resources that would lead us to Greenland, to greendom. So I want to say that the ocean is very, very important. It's 60 to 70% depending on who you look at of the ocean, of the Earth's surface. It is home to a tremendous amount of phytoplankton, microbes for health. They've found now that tremendous amount of I saw one scientist say that we know 0.000 about life under sea. We know more about what's up in Mars than we do. And yet we are getting ready to dig 3,000 meters down into the earth, and then to bring this up and then backflow it back in without any consideration for what it might be. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the political economy behind this. I have a few words about the governance structure. And I want to start out by talking about the framing of this. panel. And I really thank Dawn for framing this panel about equality, empowerment, greenwashing, blue washing, development washing, because it's all of that and more. I think the equality dimension is what I want to talk about first. And it's not, certainly gender equality and the rights of indigenous people and coastal citizens are very prominent and paramount. But from my perspective, as following negotiation many years, I look at the ISA and they talk about the equality of all nations. And that's a sham. That is not possible when 45 million square kilometers of the ocean is already controlled by developed countries and their territories, when they control the technology, the knowledge, and the financing. And when all of our governments are being advised by external advisors who come and in particular from the finance sector, who are given advice about planning. So planning is back. That's the other thing I want to say. It's clear to me from reading literature that planning is back. It's planning the ocean. Our economies are being planned around the ocean and in a way that to service international capital and driven by the financial markets. So I think we need to look at the discourse and the narrative around that. There's a lot of, and then the other thing I want to flag, I have lots to say, but I know that we don't have enough time, so I'm just going to flag a few of what I call, as I was looking at the literature, I talked about the myths and mysticism around this. And one of the big myths is that we must harvest what's in the ocean floor for sustainability. It'll be more sustainable for us than what we do on land. And I asked myself, sustainable for who and why? So we have to negotiate, we have to question this whole idea of the scope, the nature, and the purpose of deep sea mining. What if when you industrialize the ocean, which is what we are doing? We are not greening, we are not talking about sustainability for climate, we're not talking about green economy, we're talking about industrializing the ocean for profit. And anytime you look at all of it, it's a seabed extraction, right? It's not a sustainability issue. And with technology that's been spent, is not going to be beneficial to us. And in fact, the area that's most likely to go on is the Eastern Pacific, which means that, again, it's the resources of developing countries and who will have the negative adverse, who will get the benefit, right? If we take terrestrial mining, right? I come from Jamaica where we have aluminum. None of our communities that live in aluminum areas have grown rich, have benefited. In fact, they're left with gaping holes that fills up in the flood, washing away their homes. So I cannot, in any good consciousness, think that a mining company, these are mining companies, technology and all the fancy sort, they're mining companies, right? That a mining company or any set of mining company, including their financiers, will have the heart and the mind and the rights and the equality and the living standards of the people who will be impacted by this, right? So I think the idea that we must do it because we want to have, if we want to have a carbon-free or a carbon-neutral world, we must dig up the ocean. I think that's a false narrative. It's a false discourse. I think they're also alternative to some of the nickel and cobalt that they're saying that they will need for these cars. Who are these cars for? Who dominate the driving and the utilization of these cars? Is it our people in the developing countries? Are they the one who will be affected by the backdrop of digging up the ocean and then piping back dirt into the ocean that you cannot control, which will filter back through the water columns into community inundated shores? I mean, it's just amazing to me that our developing countries, after having negotiated climate change for so long and seeing all the manipulation that went on, can still be fooled or be taken on board by this idea that somehow we're going to develop out of this. We have not benefited from the extraction of, look at any country that have extractive resources in the developing country and see where that has gotten us. So there's a nice paper I want to refer to because I won't have time to refer to it, to read through it. I wanted to go through it by Carver et al. 2020 in Oceans magazine. And they looked at the political economy of deep sea mining. And they argue that there's a narrative They look at the discourse and the practices around deep sea mining. The narrative, of course, that it's for sustainability, the narrative of development dimension, and ask what are the drivers behind deep sea mining? It's the financiers who are supporting the state in defining the new mandate, in defining the planning and defining the space. And they basically argue that we need to have more widespread discussion around the tensions, that the ocean is not out there. Deep sea mining is just not about the ocean, but deep sea mining actually impacts the coastal community. It impacts cultural rights. It impacts domestic rights. It impacts sovereignty. So we need to really unpack the political economy of this in terms of the discourse and the practices around deep sea mining.
Thank you very much, Mariama, for really kicking off and helping us punch the air above us with everything you've just said. Great energy, and thank you for highlighting some of the really, really key and worrying concerns that we're carrying here as we challenge this false narrative of the benefits of deep sea mining. I look forward to more discussions and your views in the Q&A that you can expand on in terms of the importance of oceans, the issue of governance, and the framing of equality. Thank you so much, Mariama. I take this opportunity now to introduce our second speaker, the Honorable Debbie Ngarewakaka. Honorable Debbie is a member of the Parliament of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a co-leader of the Maori Party, and Kiara Taki of Ngati Ruanui. My apologies, Honorable Debbie, if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. For 2 decades, she has been a strong advocate for Maori health and the environment in Te Tai Hauauru. She is a committed kaitiaki fighting to protect the environment, specifically leading the campaign to stop seabed mining off Te Tai Hauauru coast, confronting many adversaries and personal sacrifices. The Honorable Debbie has fought against iron sand mining off the Taranaki coast and mobilized hundreds of Taranaki people in 2004 to join the foreshore and seabed protest. In March 2021, she announced the Te Pāti Maori first member bill on the prohibition of seabed mining legislation amendment bill. Her legislation bill comes after 6 years of leading a fight against Trans-Tasman Resource Limited, a company seeking to mine the South Taranaki coast seabed. Kia ora, Honourable Debbie, and welcome.
Kia ora, tuatai ngā mihi kia koutou koe tai mai, and my greetings and aroha to everyone that's here. I think like the last speaker, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. And I am conscious, sorry, that not long after this, I have to be in the House in Parliament sitting in about 20 minutes. So my apologies if I'm not here through the whole webcam. And so I'm going to get stuck into it. I guess from our perspective, and I totally took the kōrero and the passion of Maureen of the Wahine, beg your pardon, of Miriama before me, is that this is nothing other than environmental vandalism. There's no other way to describe what seabed mining is proposing to do. And I think if we can all come from the perspective that as an Indigenous persons, we have indeed an obligation, a DNA responsibility to protect for future generations. And if we were to talk about what drives us as wahine, it is not legacy, fame, ego, profits. It's actually real simple things as a wahine, which is to ensure that my mokopuna grandchildren get to have a planet that's intact, for them to be able to be well culturally, to be well environmentally. And we have a whakaaro, which I'm sure a lot of other Indigenous whānau do, which is, most of our body is made up of water. The semen that goes to the wahine is fluid. When we're carried in our mother's womb, it's fluid. So our connection to Tangaroa, to the ocean, to everything around the ocean is inherent in our wakapapa. So when we rock our babies, and there's a rhythm that we have in our puku, in our stomach when we're carrying, that is the rhythm that comes from Tangaroa and the sea. So to disconnect and to desecrate our environment, specifically around our ocean and our seabed mining, our seabed, sorry, is to actually desecrate our ability as wahine to be able to nurture our future generations. So it is real, it's intrinsic in us culturally to fight to stop the vandalism and the desecration of anything that's connected to us through years of who we are as Indigenous peoples. The other thing is in Aotearoa, we have a tiriti, which I don't know if everyone else can relate to that, but basically it grants us our rights as the tangata whenua of the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa to protect our rights and interests, to protect our ability to be kaitiaki. So we've had real failings in our country to be able to do that. And as a consequence, we've been to 3-4 courts now that have found that the government agencies that are meant to protect our environment have failed, not once. Again, like I said, the High Court, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal and the other order have all ruled in favour for us that those who are responsible to protect our seabed haven't. As a consequence, as wahine, we were put into 3 or 4, I guess, activities. So the first for us to do intrinsically to protect our cultural being and our ability to breathe and to breed and to be able to live is our activism. So, and it's not by chance. As I was preparing for this speech, it's really interesting. Our lawyer, our frontline activists, our political, and indeed a lot of our culture were all led by wahine. Now that wasn't necessarily planned, but go figure that we're the ones that will turn up, and again in support with our tāne. But when I look at it, I was sort of having a bit of a giggle to myself, by no means of predetermining, but every part of our fight against this was driven by wahine and the values that we have. The ultimate goal is that we have to preserve this for our future generations. There was no other agenda. So I don't want to make it look like that we were rocket scientists or that we were strategically clever with a whole lot of research and academia. We weren't. We were driven by pure, the drum, the beat of the drum within our soul, and that continues to be it. And I guess the lessons as wahine that we learned is that when the beat of the drum to preserve our future came out, it was amazing who turned up. And we had, and so there were thousands in total, but from those who were planning, those who were engaged in preparing legal cases, those who were engaged in lobbying, politicians, which by the way failed us, which is why you now see me in politics. They were driven by, let me take a step back. We had a whole lot of volunteers. We were fed by volunteers. We mobilized as volunteers. We had our iwi, our tribal people that backed us as much as they could, but effectively the mobilization and the energy that went into this was very much voluntary. And I think it was that passion that absolutely made sure there's no way we're going to give this up or we're going to lose. Because the social license that these seabed miners, who by the way were all men, that come out and make promises to, we will help. And if I give a bit of context, I come from a region that is quite economically struggles. We've had high redundancies. We were driven by a lot of freezing works and factories. And so we're a lot lower in our capacity and ability to earn than other regions. So when someone turns up and says, I can give you more jobs, I promise there'll be jobs for the cleaners, there'll be jobs for the cooks, there'll be jobs for the motels. And so there was a real rise to that call. And we had to really spend a lot of time to dig down and sort of say, well, they're not going to give 1,400 jobs. They're not going to give 700 jobs. In fact, they're not going to give 100 jobs. They're specialized positions, which none of us has. They're going to fly talent in. They're going to use facilities in the big cities. They are not going to bring the promises of gold and prosperity that they were. But you spend a lot of time counteracting that argument, because when you're a desperate community you've really got to justify why you're turning away perhaps the only opportunity that your area is going to have for a long time. So there was a lot of that, and I guess the biggest part that I would sort of say about how we had to talk to each other was actually to make sure that the conversations and the debates and the misinformation was counteracted, and we spent as much time talking to ourselves about that. Because the last thing you need when you're up against these big kahunas is division. And that's the first thing they attempt to do. They went in and they romanced our local government. They had support from our central government, all the business communities, who have louder voices and bigger pockets to market that message. Were on it. They were all at it. And it was only as we started winning cases in court that they started to think, maybe those Māoris have got something. Maybe that radical woman's got a little bit of sense to what she's saying. But it took a long time for the groupthink of those that thrive off capitalism to actually drop off. In the end, we had, for example, our local mayor, who is really against us and really supportive of it, totally against it. In the end, we had politicians in opposition who were really for it, who started to see the facts and went against it and supported us. But it really took a lot of stamina to get to that stage. And so I want to acknowledge all those grassroots fighters, because like I said, that was really the activity that we had to do, which was the passion of the divers that knew the state of our reefs when these big companies were saying, they're barren, there's nothing there. And we're like, no, you're so wrong. And they'd go out and put cameras in the ocean, and they were getting all the, and I guess that was the other thing, is that we were working with people we probably haven't worked with for a long time. So, you've got to embrace that, and you've got to really encourage that, that you're not being driven by, I have to be the only one driving this. You've got to have multiple angles, I guess, in my experience and our experience of sharing the leadership. Now that's really different, especially Indigenous women, because we don't trust. Well, I can only speak for myself, but we don't trust particularly well. I mean, if you haven't lived with us for 1,000 years, we really don't trust you at all. But anyway, I can only talk from my whānau experience. So I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot of promises, and it took real grind and guts to counteract that and stay together. I think some of the questions, I really like how you've initiated them, where you're asking how we critique the actual benefits that were being promised. There was a couple of ways. Again, I think because we had a collective tribal entity, we were able to use some of their experts to assess some of the economic benefits. But the reality is, when you look at the size and the scale, and they were looking to, I think it was a 60 square kilometre space, looking to do 50 million tonnes extraction. When you look at the size of the equipment, and you look at, you're not just going to be able to dive in and be a swimmer. You actually have to be extremely skilled and qualified. So we just kept busting them for the alternative facts, and we got sponsored by different ones who would help with our newspaper campaigns, our social media campaigns, and every time we got new info, we just had a network. And there's nothing like a woman's network of being able to spread that around. And of course, we are run largely by a lot of very strong, stroppy aunties. I mean, they scare the hell out of us. So the minute they tell their kids and everyone else to spread it, this is actually how we counteracted again. So nothing particularly sophisticated. It was really just about us, again, combining the activism, the legal and the political. It got to a point in the last court case when we thought, well, this is it, yay. And then they took us back to court again. And by that stage, we decided that because none of our large parties in government were going to bat for us, even though there'd been promises made before they got elected, we decided that we needed to push stronger in the political space and once and for all get this stopped through legislation. So part of my being in there, other than addressing equality and equity, was being able to use that platform to put my first members bill together, which is to prohibit this activity once and for all. We've had support from the Greens Party. The National Party, which is one of ours, we don't expect they're going to jump on board. They're a very profit-focused party, and Labour so far have been quiet. So, and we also ran a petition with that. And I guess one other thing I sort of will drop on, hoping that I've hit what you wanted to hear today. And if I haven't, that's okay. You can question or email me anytime. But the other thing that we did from our experience was we had multiple allies, including yourselves. So we reached out to our sisterhood, our brotherhood, our Indigenous hood, our other environmentalists, and we were able to work with Greenpeace on some of the petition activity. And yeah, that's where it sits, is that I think one of the things that if I was to ever share is that we never give up. Behind me, I have 2 daughters and then a granddaughter. Ahead of me, I have these aunties with hundreds of nieces, and we just will not give up on letting anyone desecrate or deliberately vandalize our environment while, you know, expecting us to sit back and watch. So if it means that I'm uncomfortably in places in Parliament, which I probably never expected to be, and you know, have to be doing different things, then that's the degree of commitment that we have to stop this. And our mihi and our aroha to all of you that are experiencing the same battle. Koira.
Thank you so very much, Honourable Debbie. That is excellent. And yes, you have spoken to and shared so much and added to the conversation on this challenging and critiquing the benefits and the framing of this equality. It's really admirable, the journey and the fight that you have led and been part of. And I really, really appreciate the charge for the environmental vandalism that we're all facing, and we're all taking up this fight together. And it's been really great to see how you and your party have taken the political and legal steps forward, and learning from those lessons as well, and looking for opportunities to do the same within our own communities and countries. Thank you, Honourable Debbie. With that, I now jump to the third speaker, and I'll introduce Pele Martita, Tara from the Kingdom of Tonga. Tita is the project coordinator for the Civil Society Forum of Tonga and is working on the campaign against deep sea mining. She has been working in the space since 2012 and has been involved in the national campaign for a moratorium against deep sea mining and seabed mining in Tonga. She's represented the civil society's position in various local and regional meetings and has been working with communities to lobby for support of a total ban on deep sea mining since November 2020. Tita is very passionate about saving the ocean, like many of us, and saying that not only as part of our collective responsibilities towards sustaining scarce resources, but also because it is the source of livelihood for over 90% of the people of Tonga. Tita says, we and the rest of the world are connected by the ocean. So if the ocean suffers, we suffer too. Malolele, Tita, and welcome. Sorry.
Malolele, Miriam, and hello to everyone. I have to stop the tears flowing because the 2 past speakers have literally taking the words out of my mouth. So I am not going to repeat the whole eco angle because Miriam has done an excellent job, as well as covering some of the community aspect. Honorable Debbie has done a brilliant job of explaining it. And I think that's the commonality that we have across the Pacific, you know, that we feel it's not about the science. It's never about the money. This is about our livelihood. This is about our land, our ocean, and, you know, the products that we'll leave behind, and the environment we'll left behind for a generation or come. I've got 4 girls, you know, someday they will say to their own kids, this is what I passed through. And I think that's the kind of a feeling that we have. It get me really emotional because it angers me at the same time, like Miriam said, you know, I don't feel good about this. This is heartbroken for me to actually feel that we actually legalize the vandalism of our own ocean, you know, the very basic livelihood. We actually legalize it, and people are not actually standing up to fight for it and I'm so grateful that this multi-stakeholders approach that we have across the world have actually reached out and joined the fight that we have been having on the ground for generation that has passed. Tonga has about 90% coastal communities, as well as depending their livelihood in the ocean. 82% of women, who are household led, this is around nearly 20,000 families who are actually depending on the sea. 82% of these women who actually fish are actually just for consumption for their families. Only 70% of these are actually sold in the market. So there is so much gaps in the data collection and disaggregation of data that related to women in Tonga. That's because we don't stand out there and sell so we can be recorded, and be documented. Our GDP, fishery contribute roughly around 12%. So in a sense, we are not actually selling our fish, even though we have the resources. So there are two things that I'm looking at as a lot of our fish are being stolen by, foreign fisheries because we don't have enough resources to, to police our space, as well as a lot of our fish actually are for consumption. That's why this is so important. This is like that, that whole cord that connects the baby to the womb. If you cut that, if you actually legalize this vandalism, we're actually cutting that cord. And this example is during the hunger, everyone in probably half of the world knew about that eruption and the impact it has on the ocean, because there was a declaration, no fishing until they can confirm that the resources is not contaminated because of the amount of dust that have been blown out during the eruption. We heard of people, stealing to the ocean, taking fish behind the regulators' back because, where else they can turn to? It's either your land or your sea. So these are very real for us. And it's so, okay, talking about this total mining company, formerly known as Deep Green, and they have their local affiliates, the Domo. They have been campaigning since 2008 when they first had their license. We didn't have our law until 2014. They were already on the ground circulating the ideas and start putting little pockets of funding here and there for the communities. Honorable Darby has fully explained that whole process of you making the decision for your small community group, saying no to 20,000 ton pa'anga that will make a difference in putting, a public toilet or a community tank for your community. Tough choice. And, and people can look at the ocean as it will still be there tomorrow. I have to make that decision today. It made the difference. But the whole greenwashing of, this is what we do. We help the economy, we support women. And majority of these community groups are actually women with young girls. So those assistants, there are times when I actually up there in public and talking about, saying no to it, having an ethical stand that make you say no to the assistant from Donald, because that money is actually blood money, But would I come over with that 20 grand and make sure they have a community tank? Would I be there to actually put public toilet? So these are the tough goals that communities have, and which I'm battling with when you're actually out there talking to the community and helping them to make a decision. You talk about ISA, putting up this publication that 54% of all people they employ are women. 44% of all their trainees are girls, supporting the the female scientists. But the real question is, what kind of job do they hold? You know, there's a different debate on the amount of percentage that have been encouraged by the mining company when they employ women. So it ranged from 5% to 17%, depending on which literature you actually read. But the sad thing about it is like the whole retention year is basically 10. And that's actually an increase in the past 5 years from 5%. The kind of average year that a female work in any kind of mining platform is, 40 years. So we are integration into the whole mining company. So you're looking at domination of men. So within the ISA, out of the 163, the little bit of participation are actually from the Pacific who become members, with the big lion, giant companies behind them, funding and fronting them to actually be the mouthpiece. A perfect example is Nauru, triggering the 3 years rules. You're put at a hard place, between the rock and the stone. What is your choice when it does make a difference? And, our king opened the parliament this year and supporting the utilization of our minerals for economic benefit. So my own interpretation is that a royal approval for deep sea mining to proceed? So again, it's back to this is our only livelihood. But, Miriam has mentioned about whose benefit are we striving so hard to actually promote? Has there ever been any mining island or nations that had left with the promised rich that has been advocated at the beginning? No. At the beginning, they thought that Tonga might end up hosting a plant where you have hundreds of jobs. Common sense wise, Tonga is too small. That kind of a plant they expected to build need a mightier and bigger land that we have. Right next to the sea, with what, 5 meters? Highest point is 6 to 7 feet above the ground. So you're going to build a plant there? But people would want it to hear what they wanted to hear. And, these profiteers are so smart. They have crafted the narrative, beautifying this industry to be the saving grace for humankind. I don't think so, right? So, and the fact that ISA is actually, pushing for this because it's the panacea for climate crisis, it's a whole fabrication. The whole discourse that Miriam talked about, and the literature is littered with it, but of course they will not quote it. They will just retain on what they think will benefit their propaganda, right? So the common concern in Tonga is like, how can the government do this? How can we survive if this happens? The Hunga example is one perfect example. Going with our fish nearly 2 months before they actually say that it's okay to start consuming. And that's just one, eruption. You're looking at, multiple machineries, how many tons out there, generating bloom that will basically suffocate our ecosystem. So yes, that's something I don't think we should legalize. And I thank everyone for helping me do my job and help stop this gigantic monster total mining company from proceeding next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tita, for sharing what it's like on the ground there in Tonga. The tough place that communities are faced, between a rock and a hard place, having to reconcile the offer of these riches from the mining companies and then what's right in front of them. there's real risks to the environment. 90% of the community is coastal. And yes, just that example and demonstration that you shared about the eruption, and that even though this is not fish until it's safe to fish, but the reality is in the coastal communities, that's their source of food, so they're every day there. Just imagining when the mining companies come in, what does that mean for the food source and the livelihoods and the realities of Pacific Islanders? Thank you, Tita, and we look forward to more exchanges and more views in the question and answer time, especially on the ISA and your charge on their framing and their pushing within the region. Thank you. With that, I'll go to the fourth speaker and introduce Uta, our fourth speaker. Uta is from Berlin and is a political scientist working on integrated ocean governance with a focus on the institutional dimensions, environment and rights of marginalized groups, and a just transformation towards a peaceful human relationship with the ocean. She studied feminist theory and practice and international environmental regimes, and did research on the role of locally controlled governance systems in promoting or hindering collective action in favor of the conservation and sustainable use of coral reef resources. In response to the ocean climate biodiversity emergency currently before us, Uta has been following UN processes related to the SDG 14, UNFCCC, the ISA, BBNJ, and CBD in collaboration with feminist networks and other CSOs. Greetings, Uta. Good morning to you.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone who's there you're following. It's very hard to keep up with so many great women here in this panel. And I try to take you with me to the international level. And I started from the report of the ISA released in 2021, titled "The Contribution of the ISA to the Achievements of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development." And its a statement that the ISA is contributing to gender equality and empowerment of women. And the examples in this report are particularly enhancing women in marine scientific research, especially women from developing countries, and also in research companies. And so this might be the case that the ISA is actively contributing to enhancing the number of women in these research networks. But from our point of view, I think it is important to ask what are the objectives of these research, what is the outcome, what are the underlying values, and does this research enhance our understanding of how to destroy the ocean with seabed mining technologies, with destructive technologies, or does it enhance our understanding how to protect and sustainably use the ocean for the benefit of present and future generations and for their right to a healthy planet, and also for the right of marine biodiversity and marine life to exist and to maintain their vital circles. And I think, I must not answer this question. I think the previous panelists have made it clear that we know what the answer is. So from our point of view, from the point of view from the I'm working with, we do not only focus on science and the enhancement of women and empowerment of women in science and of course, science that contributes to sustainable outcomes and to a just transformation of what's needed in regard to the ocean climate biodiversity emergency. And but we also need to take into account the knowledge of women, other non-scientific knowledge of women, including traditional knowledge, and especially taking into account the role of women and their knowledge in this regard. And so here we are there's a lot of work ahead, and a lot of needs to be done to enhance the awareness and the understanding of the need of women and their knowledge and the role of and their right to engage in as critical agents of change in these emergencies. So next, I would like to address the gender equality, empowerment and participation of women in ocean governance. And as my previous speaker have already pointed to, the ISA in this regard is not really very much contributing to SDG 5. And there's a lack of women. We want, let's say, it's important that women not only can enter more spaces in science and in research, but also in ocean governance spheres that is related from planning to decision-making, implementation and review. And at all levels, from local to global, and within each level at all decision-making spaces. And so let's not only share the knowledge, but also the power. Let's change the imbalance of power in ocean governance. And in this regard, yes, the ISA has a great deficit. It is not open, it is not transparent, and a lack of women voices in these bodies and processes is obvious. And this is an instrumentalization of emancipatory language we do not accept. The sad thing is that the ISA and within UNCLOS, the ISA is dominating or making visible a discourse on gender equality and empowerment of women that is lacking under the BBNJ negotiations so far. And so on the one hand, an agency and that is promoting a destructive technology and with a disastrous impact on the marine environment, the marine biodiversity, is carrying a discourse on gender equality and women empowerment. And on the other side, a process that aims at protecting and sustainably using and preserving the biodiversity is lacking of a visibility of women, their rights, and their role in these processes. So there's an imbalance we really have to correct. And this panel is a very good start in this direction. So then in the report of 2021, the ISA states that it contributes to decarbonization, and with it to SDG 13, combating climate change. And of course, this is not true. Mining will release carbon and thus accelerating climate change. Moreover, climate change impacts already the deep sea, also in depth of relevance of mining, and this is not recognized. I point to the just released Working Group 2 report of the IPCC, which contributes to our 6 and also to the SROC that was released in the special report, the IPCC special report on ocean and climate change of 2019. Both include information on the deep sea and climate change in the deep sea. And so we can see in the deep sea that all impacts of climate change, or most of the impacts of climate change on the ocean, are already affect the deep sea, and especially warming, also acidification, deoxygenation, and these are direct impacts in the deep sea. Stratification of surface water together with processes at the surface also play a significant role, or also indirectly. So the problem is that we do not have robust observation of these impacts, and COVID-19 delayed a number of cruises and delayed information in this regard. And this is the research we need, the impacts on climate change. And I refer to the new report and pointing to that at all warming in the deep ocean, all global warming levels will cause faster movements of temperature niches by 2100 than those that have driven extensive reorganization of marine biodiversity at the ocean surface over the last 50 years. And what is also, I would like to highlight that the summary of policymakers and the technical report do not contain much information directly to the deep sea, but this is more in chapter 3 of the full report. But however, the findings of the summary for policymakers applied to the deep sea as well. And what is to be taken into consideration is that the risks in the deep sea are because a warming acidification and will continue for decades. What's happening now will affect the deep sea later for decades. It arrives there much later. So and the warming in the deep sea accelerates much more than the warming at the surface. And this has to be taken into account. And this is very important when we talk about risk reduction and impact assessment and so on. And this is, now let's ask, how does the ISA take these findings into account? How is this considered in their impact assessment when they decide on mining? And here we have a great gap. Let's start with biodiversity. Biodiversity, the CBD defines biodiversity, distinguishes species biodiversity, ecosystem biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity. And what is considered in mining impact assessments is mostly some species and not the other aspects. And many species are unknown, so how will the impact on these species be evaluated? This is completely unclear. And then climate change, warming and so on, this is not recognized yet. And therefore, if we stop mining, if we ban mining from the deep sea, this is risk reduction, impact reduction, climate responsive policy. This is a contribution to combat climate change. And banning seabed mining from going ahead is a contribution to combat climate change, to stop biodiversity loss, and to stop ocean degradation. And my final, I see I'm running out of time probably. I see you're getting nervous, Marion. Okay, but I have the fourth point, and I will be very brief on this, but this is something for the discussion as well. We are very few women at the international level fighting in so many spaces that are currently taking place at the same time, and we are very tired. And it is so important. First of all, I hope more will join, but however, I really value and appreciate the exchange with women and with networks who are fighting this on the ground. And the commitment is impressive. It gives also strength to us at the international level in these spaces to continue. And this exchange is so important. And we need it in the future. And I would like to hear your views and on how we can institutionalize this a little bit better. And because, yes, I'm sad to say it, but let's face it, I think we will not stop fighting DSM today or tomorrow. We will do it a little bit later, probably. However, I'm looking forward to your ideas, and thank you very much for having me invited and for letting me listen to so many impressive people, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta, for your presentation, for highlighting also and speaking directly to the ocean climate nexus that is, that gets left out when we're the proponents for supporting deep sea mining seem to take a different take on the benefits of DSM for climate change response, but putting the biodiversity loss front and center there, and as the impacts we've seen, it cannot be hidden. And it's an important point. Thank you very much for that, and highlighting also the contradictions within the current ISA's many tracks of what they're promoting in the different ocean spaces at the international level and their priorities, and also just speak to the solidarity of the women's movement, grassroots all the way to the global spaces up there at the UN in New York and Geneva, and definitely echo your sentiments about continuing to stay connected and to support each other, Uta. As we are about to go into our final speaker for the day, I'd just like to reiterate for those of you who are interested to ask questions to the panelists as we go into Q&A after the final speaker, please post your questions in the box. We have a couple coming through in the chat box. If I can ask you to move your questions to the Q&A box that's there. And then, let's kickstart with the final speaker of today, and it's co-host here, Maureen Petuelli, as our fourth speaker. And Maureen has over 20 years of experience in nonprofit sector, working mainly in the field of environment, economic, political, and social justice in the Pacific region. She's the current coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization, PANG, our co-host for the webinar today, and is also one of the initiators of the Pacific Blue Line campaign, a collective campaign calling for a global ban on deep sea mining. Maureen, Bula Vinaka, and greetings. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Nisam Bula Vinaka, and warm greetings to everyone. Given the time constraints, I'm just going to jump into it. And as the last speaker, I'm just going to kind of emphasize where emphasis is needed. And I want to just really start with where Uta left off, really to understand ISA's interpretation of what it means when it says it's advancing women's empowerment and leadership. And it has this three flagship projects to measure women's empowerment and leadership. And that first one has to do with gender parity at the Secretariat itself. So on gender parity at the ISA, which is located in Jamaica, it's achieved a 54% of staff who are women. I don't know what that means in terms of seniority of staff, but that's the kinds of data sets that's coming from the ISA. On the other two flagship projects, one is, I think Mariama touched on it, and Peter also touched on it, but it's really targeting LDCs, least developed countries, landlocked countries, women in particular around scientific research, and I think Uta touched a bit on this. To date, 500 individuals from developing countries have benefited, including 44% of women. So that's really less than 250 women in total in that flagship program that ISA is running. The final one is really looking at contractors training program. So there are currently 31 contracts in the high seas. And there's a pledge to reserve half of their training opportunities for women wherever possible. So 7 out of those 31. And that's the ISA's real claim and flagship around women's economic empowerment and leadership. So I want to then step back and look at some of the real structural barriers that we are facing, particularly from a Pacific context, in 2 ways. We are at the forefront of deep sea mining because within our national jurisdiction, all of our countries, sovereign countries in the Pacific region, have tenements, have issued tenements. We have laws that have really signal that we are the frontier region of the world. Secondly, and in areas beyond national jurisdiction, 5 of our Pacific Island countries, Nauru, Tonga, Cook Islands, Kiribati, and just last year, Tuvalu, are all sponsoring states. And so here it becomes really complicated because we have to fight on 2 fronts. Within our jurisdiction, where Tita is doing a phenomenal job in Tonga, trying to slow the kinds of push by our states. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is the capturing of our states' imagination from the very beginning. The fact that deep sea mining is presented as very low risk, sometimes no risk at all or impacts at all, and extremely staggering economic returns have really bought the imaginations of our political elites in our countries. And in many ways, it is why we are at the forefront of deep sea mining, despite, as Mariama really put quite clearly, despite the fact that we are the moral champions and authority on the climate crisis. But we've been bought from the very beginning that this is about economic and economic benefits. So the way our laws have been structured to enable deep sea mining within our jurisdictions have failed structurally from the very beginning on things like consultation. In many of our jurisdictions, consultations, you get 24 hours, 48 hours, a week to respond to government's enabling legislative environment to kickstart. And part of this relates to the fact that government view minerals as belonging to the state. One. Secondly, they view that there are not many people who can make claims, including indigenous communities, let alone civil society. So in the structural barriers of engagement have been designed from the very beginning to limit and in most cases keep women out of negotiations at the national level. So from the very beginning, for many of us who've been in this work, we've been upfront in front of our technical agencies, in front of our governments, demanding that they do basic consultation processes that are extensive. And that's been a long battle, 10 years of engaging to improve these kinds of structural barriers, to challenge narratives around benefits, come right down to the basics of the fact that we were never at the table from the beginning. Laws were designed, this was presented as something that would take place, not need free, prior, informed consent of our people. So what you find is that today, within our jurisdictions right across the Pacific, our very own governments do not have free, prior, informed consent of our people within our jurisdictions, let alone at the ISA. If you overlay the kinds of structural governance problems of the ISA, understanding this from the fact that we've got these 5 countries who are sponsoring states, they also have not done the basic due diligence process of consultation with our own people. So here we are at the global arena being the champions of this with very little understanding. What this really says is that we've disproportionately shifted the debate from contractors, private actors and companies, our very own governments, to women communities, indigenous women and communities, to articulate why this is such a bad proposition. From the very beginning, we have had to establish scientifically, legally, economically, morally on why it is such a bad proposition. And so I think this is what the Pacific resistance have been coming up. I want to really emphasize the basis of what Honorable Debbie Parker talks about. Why is it that we've drawn hard lines in the ocean? And this idea that there's a dichotomy, that we are against development, against scientific research, that's the argument. When you're at the ISA or when you're meeting with contractors in our very own governments, they frame us as women who oppose science and scientific research, women who oppose development, and women who oppose alternative economic pathways for our governments. But we are very clear from the onset on why we've drawn this line, this blue line. To understand benefits, one must really appreciate and understand impacts. And really all the evidence within jurisdiction. And again, this is not far out. In the case of Papua New Guinea, tenements are less than 30 kilometers from the nearest communities. That's not far. And the initial anecdotal evidence is very quite clear of how bad this is. To what Tito was saying, livelihood options around protein, fish, livelihood, those would be dramatically affected by cultural practices such as shark calling would be implicated and affected by. If we extrapolate impacts so when you're looking at deep sea mining, you're looking at anything deeper than 200 meters up to 7,000 meters below the sea level. That's quite a huge area of jurisdiction. One of the key things is that responding to these claims, and again, we are in a situation where we are responding to claims by contractors. They've established that nothing lives in the abyssal. We have to demonstrate that, in fact, biodiversity, very specific biodiversity and ecosystems thrive in the abyssal. The conditions in which these were formed took millions of years to form. Contracts in the high seas is about 30 years in total. The scientific evidence now is that we would destroy these systems that took millions of years within these kinds of very small human time scales of 30 years, and recovery would not take place within human time scales at all. the idea that you could remediate, protect, or conserve endemic species thrive in these areas. The idea, there's so much in science that we don't understand around just biodiversity, ecosystems, both at the substrata level, but also within the water columns. Our governments are not paying attention to how those sediment plumes will spread and affect key economic industries such as fisheries, which is economic lifelines for Pacific Island countries. So when we look at the way that science is coming out at sedimentation plumes within the area where most of the contracts is taking place under the ISA's guidance, sedimentation plumes from could remain suspended in water columns for extensive periods of time. So 300 days could be suspended. It travels slowly across and could affect neighboring jurisdictions, if you like. So again, the science is catching up on. And so when you think about 30 years and all of these contractors operating at intensive levels, you begin to appreciate impact. So that challenges this narrative around benefits. The second key thing is around due diligence of our states and liability. This is the one area that our governments in particular do not want to focus on, but they should. We have real experiences, particularly in the case of Papua New Guinea versus Nautilus Inc., Canadian company that went bankrupt. In fact, they went for investor-state dispute, arbitrated. The PNG government lost, had to pay up $150 million, and Nautilus directors walked off with tidy little profits. There's a new investor-state dispute that's worth mentioning. This is the Texan-based Odyssey company that's taken the Mexico government to an investor-state dispute with a claim of $3.54 billion. So you can see what's at stake. And I want to come back to the key things that both Mariama and Uta raised around the climate crisis and why we have to draw serious lines. We are from a region where our obligations to protect the life-giving sources of the ocean is quite critical. At a time when the world under the blue economy narrative wants to industrialize all activities on the ocean floor, we have to pay attention to the ocean's role in regulating our climate. It's the longest, most stable carbon sink. The science in terms of understanding how DSM will affect these long-term carbon sinks is still outstanding. How it will affect things like methane seeps is still outstanding. And so I just want to come back to say that from a Pacific perspective, we have long experiences around the kinds of pinkwashing, development washing, greenwashing agendas, because and I think the global South, we have this experience to recognize when institutions, transnational corporations frame, we recognize them because we've been here before. This is not new. As Mariama said, we've been here before. We know the language of persuasion. We know the language of articulation that captures our political elite and agency. And the fact that they use women economic empowerment, greenwashing these minerals is in many ways a desperate attempt to make mining palatable. But the more we understand what is at stake and what is at risk, it is why we really invite people to join us. And I think Uta's point, there's so few of us at the multilateral, regional, national level, particularly women at the forefront of this. We need more women, more agency across sectors and movements to join in. Because what is at risk is something much more fundamental, and that's our planetary life-giving functions of the ocean. That's what's at risk. Thank you, Ani.
Thank you, Maureen, for those the final presentation, but also reiterating really important points, and the fears that we are all looking at deep sea mining at through the lenses of, and our concerns and worries as our states and our political elites are evidently captured by the sing song and the great deal that's been prompted by these companies and these the big countries that are interested in our minerals. This takes us now to the Q&A time. I think we've got 2 questions and not a lot of time, so I'm just going to ask both the questions. And I think some of the presentations already have spoken to a couple of these questions, especially Honorable Debbie is no longer with us, but I think she did emphasize about the journey her mobilizing and her community has done to resist seabed mining in New Zealand. But the first question, and if Tita and Maureen would like to speak to this as well, particularly, and Uta and Mariama might want to add in as well, is from Peggy Entrobus, and she's asking our Pacific representatives here on the mobilization of Pacific women to resist seabed mining is really impressive. And she's wondering, how did it start? And was there any particular incident or analysis that led to this activism? Maybe Tita in Tonga would like to speak to that and share on her experience, and whether you have any advice to our sisters and colleagues in the Caribbean who are also mobilizing and interested to take this up. Sorry, Tita, your mic is on mute.
Okay. Thank you again, Melanie. I think this is basically by default that we happen to be more women in the space. But I think from personal experience, as indicated before, 82% of these women, fish for survival, for their families, for their livelihood. Kind of like, a statement on its own. We have more to lose. We are the mothers. We care more for the livelihood of our family. We put food on the table, when they're hungry, they run to the mothers. And, it's that kind of inbred kind of like ethics we were raised with. So anything that we know is a source of livelihood, we defend. Because at the end of the day, if you lose that, ultimately we suffer. And the ocean is one of it. So how this evolve, when I joined civil society, and Siale was the executive director, and quite passionate about this. There were really only a handful of us, but I think this might be supported by one of the statement on the literature of the Intergovernmental Forum for Metal Minerals Mining for Sustainable Development, as well as McKenzie and Company, and also Australia's International for Mining and Metallurgy, that say that, that they need gender integration into this industry. Women has been assessed to be more innovative, more flexible, and more visionaries because of the wider experience, whether that is scientifically proven or not. The fact that these 3 very trustworthy sources have said otherwise, meaning that, women are drawn into this because they are, more visionary, more innovative, and they can see the whole holistic picture rather than the silos where they, kind of box into just making money. So I think this is it. My advice is, as a mother, the ocean and the environment is something worth defending for sustainability of this earth. And, there's already many of us there. So you speak your heart, people will follow.
Thank you, Tita. Maureen, would you like to share a comment on Pacific mobilizing and what triggered us to stand up for this?
I think a little bit like what Tita said. I think we were pushed in many ways when we saw like draft legislation being presented, and it kind of gave a green signal that there was an assumption that this was simply going to go ahead without any resistance. So we really had to organize ourselves. It's a highly technical area. You need science, economists, you need geologists, biologists, the skill sets necessary just to deal with the legal nature of greenlighting this was very clear from the beginning. We've had to build our own knowledge, systems and understanding within jurisdiction, and obviously now extending it. And again, but we come from a place where we immediately understood what the proposal threatened, which is very much to do with livelihoods, food security and sovereignty. It would challenge cultural practices. And then, of course, we've learned that it would affect the kinds of climate functions as the science grew. But we knew immediately that this was a very bad proposition for our people from the beginning.
Thank you, Maureen. We've seen some questions come in, but we're actually almost out of time. And I'm just going to move to ask one more question that has been sitting here. And it's to all the 4 speakers that we have remaining. And it is looking at the ocean climate nexus. And it's asked by Salote Songo. And she's asking, how do these 5 Pacific countries and governments, Nauru, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, etc., reconcile their activism for climate change with their sponsorship of deep sea mining? How would FPIC be effective in changing their sponsorship? And this speaks again to what Mariama challenged us at the beginning of this presentation about that contradiction of small island developing states. We were the ones fighting for the address to climate change on one hand, and in the same breath also on another hand, promoting this destruction and leading and sponsoring this destruction. So if I can pose as the last question and also give each of you a chance to put in some final words here as we reach the close of our call today, and start with Mariama, if you'd like to speak first to this question on reconciling that contradiction between climate justice and this pro-deep sea mining.
Hi, so I don't know that I can speak to reconciling it because I'd get myself into a lot of trouble. But I think there are 2 things I want to address. I want to say that we have to be very clear about not buying into this narrative about deep sea mining being part of blue growth or resource frontier, or even what many Pacific Islanders are talking, and others even in Africa are limping it in part of national security or security interests, right? We have to really divorce that. Deep sea mining is not about blue growth. It's not about resource frontier or preserving our resource frontier. I think we have to look at the political ramification of that. And I think that's maybe how a lot of our Pacific brothers and sisters got bought into this. When you come already from a blue economy framework, it's pretty easy then to talk about that. And I think the other thing that's clear that I'm investigating a little bit is, let's not be too comfortable by environmental impact assessment, because the traditional environmental impact assessment is useless for deep sea mining. You are talking about digging up 3,000 meters beyond the sea, right? Which I saw estimation that they're going to be digging up per day 2 to 6 million cubic feet of marine sediments, ground rocks and stuff, and then bring it up to the surface, sift it out, and throw it back in the water. You throw it back in the water, you cannot control it. It goes back, it has more implication than the 200 meters of our EPEEZ, right? That has regional implication. It has implication as far away as far as Caribbean and other places, because you cannot control a rapidly moving current, right? So that's the respiratory function of the ocean. the fishes and all of the creatures that live in it will be impacting. And I was really laughing because I read that Yale study. You see that Yale study? They said, oh, well, but the ocean will clean it up. So only a little bit will go back. But what we need is simulation. And I've seen a simulation that I've done when they've looked at, if you dig that up, as you said, Maureen, the scarring of the ocean bed, millennium for it to clean up, the livelihood does not return. So I think we have to really go in the direction of these simulation and not the traditional EIA. That is useless in this case. This is a whole nother ballgame that we've not seen before in our lives. So I think the climate link is very clear that the deep sea mining is not just the seabed issue. It involves extraction, it involves transportation, processing, and all of this are impacting the water column and the various sea surfaces and land. It's not a sea issue only. It has implications for terrestrial, for land and terrestrial issues. It's not going to stay in the sea. What happened in the sea will not stay in the sea at the level of which we're digging into the sea. So it has implications for all of us who have coastal communities and our island nation. And it's not just, Nauru cannot just make that decision for itself, because that has implication for all of us. And I think we need governments to wake up and really begin to look at that. And I'm not comforted, but I'm glad that even some of the business communities have come out, 700 scientists have come out to say we need to ban this or we need to moratorium it. Most scientists are saying we need to study it. They're now finding out that a lot of the microbes have antibacterial that they didn't know before for human health, right? So all of these things are unknowns, but they're pivotal to our living. And I think, our government might have been taken by this green growth, blue growth narrative, but now they know. They cannot say they don't know. They cannot say it's a few women who are anti-development. They now know. The body of evidence is coming out. It's not all clear in everything, but it says precautionary, it says prudence, it says take time. I am not sanguine that ISA will come up with a different set of rules, because ISA itself is problematic. It has a moral problem. There is no way that you can be both for deep sea mining and protecting the environment. Those two mandates cannot go together, and that needs to be broken up. How can an institution that's benefiting from approving contract, it gets $500,000 per contract, and then it gets money, it's never yet denied a exploratory license? There's a problem there. There's a moral problem, a moral hazard problem there. So it's not just our government, the international, whoever wrote that, and our government agreed to it, so they are implicated in it. It's corruption at the source. You cannot have a body that's regulating for profit where its own interest and its survival depends on selling licenses and benefit from the profitability of the earth. That doesn't make any sense to me. I find that abhorrent,
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mariam. I mean, ISA has a moral problem is such a powerful statement, and I'm sure we all agree with that and see so evidently in all facets of our advocacy and all our different areas of work that's connected to deep sea mining, that they play a huge role, as well as our states, in ensuring that we roll back on this advancing to DSM. If there's anyone else from the panel who would like to also speak to this, as your final comments as we close. Go ahead, Uta, if I can get the... Thank you, Uta, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Mariama made a very good point that the traditional environmental impact assessment is of no use in this context of seabed mining. And seabed mining is not consistent with Article 146 of UNCLOS, which aims at protection of the marine environment. And as well as with many other international commitments that states have signed. However, the contradiction between was mentioned with regard to Pacific states is also something we face at the international level. I pointed to this earlier, but now I would like to underscore how absurd the situation is again, that in Jamaica, UNCLOS parties negotiate on the long-term destruction of the ocean and marine biodiversity. And in New York, UNCLOS parties and other states are negotiating on the long-term preservation of the marine biodiversity. This is absurd. And especially taking into consideration that the ISA has already established its decision-making procedures, its regulations. So they are now accelerating their negotiations that may be finalized and so mining may start before the BBNJ agreement comes in place. So we may face a situation that the biodiversity is already lost when the instrument comes in place to protect it. And what is important that in New York, we have in the draft understanding of environmental impact under the term environmental impact assessment. It's also in the draft that a concept of environmental impact assessment taking into consideration cumulative impact, including climate change, socioeconomic impacts, cultural impacts. And so this is a more comprehensive understanding. And of course, this contradicts seabed mining. And it is also discussed with regard to strategic assessment and planning, marine special planning. So which is a broader process and also involving review and adjustment of regulations, which is not addressed in the ISA so far. And the question is, and this is something we need to raise awareness to, that what is negotiated at both sides there currently and also elsewhere is so tremendously important to life on this planet. And we must not leave it to parties of the UNCLOS negotiating more or less among themselves without public attention to this. And based on a concept, based on a regulation that originate from the 70s, well ahead from the crises we're facing now. And so this must not become reality. We must not allow this. And this needs greater public attention and more resistance, and at all levels. And point to another topic. I learned a lot in this panel, and I take this with me. And I hope we continue this exchange. And I also want to point to another region that is coming up that is in focus for mining. This is the northern mid-Atlantic ridge. And unfortunately there, the situation is different. There are no communities close by. And I'm afraid that the attention, what is going there, is much lower, even much lower in this area and than it is in the Pacific. So it is so important what you are doing. You are a model for others, what comes ahead, what may be coming in other regions. And so therefore it is very important to learn from your lessons and to continue the exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta. Over to our final speakers for their final wrap-up comments. Who would like to go? Tita, would you like to make a final comment here before we close up? Oh, sorry. Tita,
thank you. I think I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for the invite. It's timely, and I think the experience of having the hunger and the COVID cases in Tonga kind of like distracted my attention for a while, but this really put me right back to where I need to be in defending the environment where we just saw the experience. The wealth of experience of change here today is tremendous, and thank you so much for having a voice from Germany and a voice from the African states. It kind of bringing that flavor that despite wherever we are, demonstrated we are interconnected in this world by the ocean that we love to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Tita. Over to you, Maureen, to close us off. Thank you.
Really just to say, I think we all fully understand what is at stake now. And I think it's very clear that we need to join together. As Uta points out, it's not over. And we still have some time to really stop this. So please sign the petition. We've posted it on the chat, in the chat box, because we do have to signal very strongly to the UNGA that ISA's mandate doesn't go far enough in protecting the ocean and its life-giving services. So the fight is not over. Join us, sign the petition. There's many of us working on this front. Yes, so please do keep in touch with us. This campaign will still go on, and we need every one of us taking a stake in the common heritage of all of us, on behalf of all of us. So join us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, our panelists today. I mean, yes, I reiterate what Tita said. This is just, great speakers, great exchange, and it's really fired the fire in my belly to continue and to continue these conversations, but most importantly, continue to fight and, promote the banning of deep sea mining. To our participants who stayed on, beyond the time as well, fully engaged. Thank you also for your time, and look forward to engaging in more of these conversations online and hopefully face to face soon. Good luck to Maureen and Uta, who are at the BBNJ or covering BBJ at the moment, and CBD, and taking our fight at the international stage. Thank you all. Have a great remainder of your day, or the start to the day or close to the day. Thank you for your time. This recording for this video will be posted online on YouTube and Dawn's page. So please share with your networks, because this is such a great discussion. There's so many key points, and we'll try and share it with the guys at the ISA as well, because as Uta said, it's quite absurd what's happening up there. So thank you very much, and rest well, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dawn and Pine.
Naka.
Thank you, Uta. Thank you so much for your work.